Good evening and welcome to your Cannabis Equity Minutes with Cynthia Mompoint on this July 6, 2021 evening. And we are going to kick it off with our quick check into the data to see if we've seen any movement both on the national front and the local front here in Massachusetts when it comes to equity and ownership, when it comes to legalization and the impact that it's having in the cannabis industry. And then we're just going to take a look at where we are in general, where we are in moving the needle with equitable participation in equitable measures, things that are going to result in outcomes that align with the rhetoric that we have used for so long to push the need and demand for legalization. So as it stands here on both fronts, nationally and locally here in Massachusetts, there hasn't been much traction over the last week. Perhaps one may say it's because of the timing with the 4th of July, if you will. And for whatever reason, we're still at 256 businesses operational in Massachusetts. And on the national front, we have 19 states that have some form of legalization. Now, in our last time together, we touched on the issue with Sha'Carri Richardson and her testing positive for cannabis use. And one of the messages that we left was this is a cannabis community issue, except for when it comes to how her enforcement, whatever penalization is enforced, right? As it stands on an international front, it's clear, cut, and dry. The Olympics continues to hold on to their stance with cannabis use and any type of drug use, particularly ones that they've deemed having some performance enhancement. And I mean, the point of the conversation isn't whether or not the rationale is accurate. The point of the conversation was the fact that she tested positive 3 weeks before the Olympics are set to set off. And the comment that I left you with was we needed to see if discretion would be exercised in her situation, and not just on an individual level, but also in terms of messaging as to where we are with looking at cannabis as a plant and whether or not we're going to continue to criminalize it. The gist of it is the USA track and field Olympic team decision makers decided that they were not going to put Sha'Carri Richardson onto the roster for the Olympics. Now, you may ask yourself, was there an opportunity to? Yes, because her suspension was for 30 days, which means she technically would be able to run the relay despite the Olympics starting earlier than her 30-day suspension. She would be able to run the relay if the USA team decided to put her on. But the decision was made not to put her on. Now, regardless of the rationale, this was an opportunity for the United States to really step up and say whether or not where their stance was when it comes to the war on drugs, right? The piece about legalization has been, well, you know, the war on drugs has had devastating effects on our communities, particularly Black and brown folks, and we don't want to perpetuate that anymore. We want to stop that. We want to legalize it. This is the messaging, right? This is how the community, the people, the public at large, when you see statistics showing 90% plus of Americans stating that cannabis should be legal and that the war on drugs needs to end, many folks think that when you hear a state has gone legal, that that's what's happening, and that is not the case. Not only is it not the case because it's still considered a federal illegal drug, it's not the case because in these very states that you see cannabis is legal, the arrest rates and the disparity in these arrest rates continue to increase. Now, the only way you can have a disparity of arrest rates increasing is if arrests are continuing. And the only way arrests are continuing is if the war persists. And so that's what we see happening. And in this particular instance, not just this particular instance, in every instance, we are constantly faced with discretion, right? Subjective discretion by decision makers as to how they're going to enforce the rules, whatever the laws that have been created and that are currently on the books. And in that instance, we saw time and time again that the decision was made against Sha'Carri Richardson. In this case, this is aside from the fact that she has taken accountability for her personal actions. Again, the focus is not just on an individual. The focus is on the bigger picture and the messaging here, right? Because there's a cognitive dissonance that's happening across our country between the rhetoric to say that we want legalization because we want to end the war on drugs, but then when it's time to make key decisions, we don't see those decisions aligning with that. Again, one of the things that I am a strong proponent of is that the expected outcomes align with the actions and the stated goals. And if that's not happening, there is a dissonance that needs to be addressed. And when we look across the country, we look at various measures and efforts for legalization, and then their conversation about ending the war on drugs, or the language around social equity, right? That's something that we have here in Massachusetts. Social equity, we have equitable participation baked actually into our legislation. And then we see the actions that are taken, and we have to ask ourselves, well, is that really the outcome we're looking for? Or are we just content with saying, hey, the opportunity was there. We know that there are barriers that exist to exercising that opportunity, but we're not going to address that. And we're just going to leave it at, hey, we did what we said we were going to do. And good luck to those of you who can overcome the gauntlet that exists and never address the actual war that was orchestrated against our citizens, against Black and brown people, and many other folks fell prey to. So until we are looking at actions that we are literally demonstrating a form of insanity. And I want to loop back and say that, when we don't study history, we fall prey to repeating it. Here it is, today's July 6th. One of the, yesterday marked the, I don't know, maybe about 170-year anniversary since Frederick Douglass gave his July 5th speech. And on that speech, let's quick history. He was invited by the ladies of Rochester to speak on an anti-slavery movement that they were having in New York. Now, let's pay attention here. A couple of things. One, this was something about anti-slavery. This was specifically something that was going to benefit Black people. And they reached out and hired him to speak on behalf of this issue. They didn't reach out and hired other abolitionists or allies who play a significant role, an important role. They have their part to play. But when it comes down to being at the forefront of these conversations, the decisions, and leading the charge, they reached out to Frederick Douglass, a very powerful orator. And originally, perhaps in what intentionally or woeful ignorance, they reached out for him to speak on the 4th of July. And he said, absolutely not. Why? Because he's extremely cognizant of paradox that was happening at that time. Instead, he agreed to give a speech on the 5th of July. So they convened their conference there in Rochester. And when he spoke, he opened up his speech with, I think it was titled, "What to the American Negro is the 4th of July?" When here it is, they are asking folks to fight for freedoms and to celebrate freedoms that the American Negro did not have. 1852, slavery was still in effect. And so why does that matter? Because here it is today, 2021, and we are asking communities to push for legalization, right? To say cannabis should be legal. But yet, in the very token that we're arguing for cannabis to be legal, we have our Black and brown people continuing to be um, targeted, not targeted for this plant, and then arrested. We have folks who are still in prison for their use and participation of the plant. The trauma tied to it, none of this being addressed, simply the leveraging our energy, leveraging our trauma to push for a legalization effort that would result in monetizing, taxation, creating jobs, lining the coffers of the well-capitalized people who continue to benefit from this industry, regardless, even in prohibition, they benefited from this industry. And who, when I say these people, to be clear, I'm talking about white men who continue to dominate in this space on the legal front and capitalizing on it monetarily, while we see Black and brown men attacked, traumatized, demonized, dehumanized for their participation with this plant. So when we have these conversations about equity, we cannot let it slide and get comfortable with all of the hoopla and the energy around the term legalization, and just the flag that they raised to say, hey, we're going to end the war on drugs, and we want to address those who've been harmed the most by that war on drugs. We need to ask for specifics as to what does that address look like? Where is the wartime relief for the war on drugs? Where is that? And if that's not in the conversation, if when we look at legalization, but when we look at the measures that are being pushed forth, whether it's the bills, the policies, or the habits of practice, if we don't see these actions, the wartime relief, we don't see these things spelled out explicitly, then we can't expect to see that in the outcomes, and we surely cannot be surprised when we don't see it in the outcomes, because it was never part of the original goal. It was part of the conversation to get to the goal, but the goal was and continues to be legalization for the purposes of monetization and taxation. And until we address that, that's not going to happen. I highlighted the fact that these women hired and brought in Frederick Douglass to speak. Why? Because one of the things we see now, particularly in places like here in Massachusetts, where we have positive impact plans, community reinvestment expectations included in our the policies rolled out for legalization in our industry. And so these businesses are going out, doing what the expectation for them is, putting together these plans, but then they're reaching out to women, particularly white women, looking to them to lead the charge on addressing those who've been harmed the most by the war on drugs. And it leaves us with a missed mark. It leaves us with programming, messaging that is benefits white women. It's inclusive. I heard someone talking about Massachusetts social equity, and they said, "Oh, it's race neutral," which that's fine. But the war on drugs and the target of the war on drugs was not race neutral. So when we say we want to address the war on drugs, we need wartime relief. We need to make sure that it's just as targeted. And so these businesses who say that they want to be on the right side of history, who say that they want to have a significant impact in this space of equity, also have their responsibility in looking at who are they contracting, who are they hiring, who are they reaching out to, and reaching out to in a business capacity, right? Because folks always like to have the Black folks come in and speak and share their presence or co-sign their efforts without the compensation, right? But the women in this space, the white women in this space, have been around Perhaps not at the front of the table, but around long enough to say, oh, wait a minute, I know the dollars that you have, and I know the dollars that you can put behind the work that you're asking for. And we expect that. And so that level of expectation needs to be across the board. Businesses need to hire and reach out to support and contract with organizations, companies, such as my company. I have a company. I spend this time sharing with you the Cannabis Equity Minutes because this is an issue that's dear to my heart, right? But in terms of being about the business of bringing change, being about the business of identifying actions that are going to lead to outcomes that actually align with the goals and the rhetoric of these goals, I have a whole business sector for that, and that's called the Dambala Group. And this is something that I open up to the businesses and to organizations in Massachusetts and in other states where my team is able to provide that insight and planning, consulting work to achieve these goals. But if your business isn't doing that, what are you doing to address the war on drugs? What is your role? Or are you simply pushing the same status quo? Are we seeing history repeat itself in just a more sophisticated manner? Are you operating in a level of cognitive dissonance where you're saying you want to reach out to those who've been harmed the most by the war on drugs? And the Dambala Group does have that on the team. My team consists of that. And we have, what's interesting is when you start to look at the people who've actually been harmed and you start looking for solutions through their lens, you start to get at outcomes, proposals, plans that moves the needle for equity. You start to get solutions that actually has an impact on communities, and everyone benefits. It's the same concept for those who deem themselves in the progressive camp, if you will, and they understand it when it comes to diversifying your staff and your workforce, whether it's not just gender diversification, but also racial diversification and class diversification, perspective diversification. It makes for a better team. It makes for a better company. It yields better insight and better results, if you will, whether your result is external and outputting, or your result is gleaning more customers and clientele, right? So there is a significant power when you align yourselves in a respectable, professional, and business manner with companies such as my company, such as those who are committed to equity, those who have the experience and the business acumen to understand how to navigate this space and create solutions that are going to effectuate the change that so many of us have committed to, and the movement in itself purports that we are uplifting, that being addressing the war on drugs. So I definitely put that out. I think in the past I've talked about some of the work that I've done. The constructing the PIES program, again, a solution that I benefit from in its adoption here in the state of Massachusetts. That was part of the lens from which I constructed it. Also, in terms of drafting reports and being able to look at things with the lens of equity and being able to tie that to outcomes. So often we rely on what's already been done and then have scratch our head or in some cases just kind of keep it pushing and not do anything when the outcome perpetuates what's already been done. And so it's this industry, it's still in its infancy, and the language is there, the responsibility is there, even because of the fact that this is a war that continues to perpetuate. And so wartime relief, just as we've done in every other situation, every other war that we have enacted on a particular population, people, country, whether it's on our homeland territory or across the other parts of the globe, we need to see that take hold and come into play. And on that note, we will wrap up our Cannabis Equity Minutes for this evening and tune in to see what movements we see on the national front in Massachusetts. Check out the blog as well. And if your company is looking to make bold moves and have a positive impact in your community, tap into the Dumbala Group on dumbalagroup.com. Reach out to us and we can talk about ways to achieve that. Have a good evening.